king's man. We're going to go to 1 Samuel chapter 15. We're not necessarily going to talk about what it means to be a king's man yet, because we have to look at one particular aspect. And so here it is being said, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. So the Bible here is speaking of obedience. Yes. And obedience is a very important aspect that we need to first discuss and cover today. Here, King Saul, the king of the nation, is being reprimanded by the prophet Samuel because he is not being obedient to what the Lord has commanded him to do. Right. Now, we're not going to get all into that story today because that's not necessarily what we are here to talk about, but rather we are looking at this particular example because we need to look at the topic of obedience. King Saul was not obedient to what the Lord wanted him to do, which is why we find Samuel disciplining him and asking the question, what would the Lord prefer? Would he prefer you to be obedient or offer a sacrificial offering? To which the answer, although not answered there, is very clear. The Lord would rather you be obedient. Right. Because that's what this whole conversation is about. That's how Saul messed up. This whole conversation is the Lord wants obedience. Right. The king wants obedient subjects. Yeah. What good is a kingdom if the subjects merely do their own will? If King Saul said, hey, we're going to show up to battle tomorrow about 3 o'clock, and, well, some of the subjects say, well, King Saul, I don't know. I got some corn in the field, and that needs to come in, and then, my wife's got a to-do list for me, and so I got to, paint the baseboards and do all that and fix the fence, and, my son, little Jimmy, he needs to be picked up from school at about 3 o'clock, so I don't think I can make it. What good is the kingdom if the subjects are not obedient? Yeah. Jesus, he comes down to earth in Philippians 2:8. It tells us in being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and he was obedient. Yes. He was obedient to the point of death, even a humiliating death. Death on a cross. Yeah. See, Jesus, he was obedient to the order. He was obedient to his last breath. He didn't waver. The Bible would say he didn't turn to the right hand or to the left. And everything that he did the will of his Father. Yeah. And what he spoke, it was the will of God. Yeah. And how he acted, it was the will of God. And how he lived out his life, it was the will of God. Jesus was obedient throughout his entire life. Yes. And he surrendered his human will, which, by the way, was not to go and die. His human will said, no, I actually don't want to go and do that. But he surrendered and he was obedient. Yes. And obedience took him to death. Right. Paul writes in Romans chapter 6, do you not know to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey? Mm-hmm. You are that one slave whom you obey, whether it's sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness. Whoever you obey, and there are only two options. Right, that's true. Either you obey sin, which leads to death, or you obey God, which leads to life. Whoever you obey, Paul says, you are a slave to. Mm-hmm. No matter which one you pick, you will be obedient to something. Right. It doesn't matter the choice. There's no deceptive ultimate freedom here. You will either be obedient to your sinful desires or you will be obedient to God. Yeah. There is no other option. That is it. That is life. You can be obedient to your desires and what you want to do and live in sin, or you can be obedient to God. But either way, you're going to be obedient to something. Right. He goes down, verse 17, it says, but God be thanked that though you were slaves of sin, you obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine to which you were delivered. And having been set free from sin, you became slaves of righteousness. You used to be obedient to sin. You used to be a slave to sin. But thank God, Paul says, because you obeyed the gospel. Yeah. You obeyed the message that there is life and you were delivered from the penalty of death. And now you are obedient to God. You are, the King James Version would put it, a servant of righteousness. The New King James Versions and other versions, they say slaves to righteousness. Remember, you only have two options. And I'd rather be a slave to life than a slave to death. I would rather be a slave to life than a slave to death. If we go down to verse 22, it says, but now having been set free from sin, and having become slaves of God, you have fruit of holiness, and the end is everlasting life. Tell you what, I'm happy to be a slave to God. It's way better than being a slave to sin and death. It's way better than being a slave to the things that used to hold us down. Now, you may be kind of, ruffling your brow and saying, well, what's with all this slavery talk? I don't want to be a slave. Why is all this slavery imagery being used here? But being a slave is not actually a bad thing here. Let's take a moment to understand why this word is being used, which may cause us to have a negative reaction, but let's really discuss the meaning behind it. If you use a tool, I use Strong's Concordance, and you look at this particular word, which the King James Version, again, translates as servants, and other versions translate as slaves. Here's the meaning behind it. It's one who gives himself up to another's will. Gives himself up. Those whose service is used by Christ in extending and advancing his cause among men. It's being devoted to another, to the disregard of your own personal self-interest. See, I no longer serve my own interests. I'm not a slave to my own interests, because I've seen that my own interests, they don't actually give me what I want all the time. My own interests, they lead me to sin, and my own interests, they lead me to destruction, and my own interests, they don't always turn out the way that I want them to. But I've found that when I am obedient to the Lord, when I am a slave to God, as Paul would write, things just turn out better. When I pursue his interests, things always actually turn out fine. In fact, when I pursue God's interest, he gives me things that actually truly gratify me. He answers my needs, and he takes care of me. Yet, when I serve the Lord, when I am obedient to him, everything turns out better. So would you rather be a slave to life or a slave to death? I personally am happy to be obedient to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the eternal King, the one who sits on the throne, the one who gives me everlasting life. I'd rather be a slave to life. I'm happy to be a king's man, obedient to the king and to life. David in 1 Samuel 22, he's not yet a king. He's under great persecution, and Jonathan has given him the warning, hey man, you gotta get out of town. And so David is on the run, and Saul is about to be chasing him around the whole countryside. And although David has, yes, already been anointed as king, he's not yet king. It's like an already but not yet situation. He's a man on the run right now, and he's a fugitive. And it's here in this state of life that he escapes to the cave of Adullam. And his family hears of his predicament, and they go and they meet him there. But it wasn't just his family. It wasn't just his brothers and all his father's house that go down to meet him there. No, there's actually quite a numerous amount of people who go and meet David at the cave of Adullam. 1 Samuel 22:2, it says, everyone who is in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented, they gathered to him. And he became a captain over them, and there were about 400 men with him. So about 400 men come to David before he ascends to the throne. They come to David not during his days of power, of rule and reign, of authority and dominion. No, they come to David during the days of his rejection. They come to David when he is driven out of the palace, and they come to him when he's a nomad hiding out in caves. They chose to go to him and stand with him, the one that the authorities are rejecting. And these men, they lived with David, and they learned to endure as David endured. And they learned to fight as he fought, and they learned to win battles with him, and they learned to lose some battles with him. They came along with him through the rough situation. They came to him in distress. Those who were persecuted by Saul or subject to injustice, they were grieved by what was happening in their nation. They were in distress. They came to him in debt. They weren't able to pay what they owed. And it's not necessarily that they were looking to escape their debt in an evil and conniving way, but they were just looking for a better way. They were looking for someone to help them out, a way out of the oppression. And they came to him discontent. They didn't like the way that things were going, and they weren't willing to accept the policies of Saul. They weren't willing to accept the rule and the reign of Saul. They came to him unhappy, flustered, and they were looking for a better way. And this was the group of men that came to David. It was a ragtag bunch of guys down on their luck, and their lives weren't heading in the direction that they wanted it to, or that they necessarily foresaw for themselves. And they were in an unhappy situation. They didn't like where their country was going. This is not a prominent, wealthy, and incredibly powerful group of men. No, this is a group of men who are frustrated and mistreated by life. They're trying to look for something better, and so they look to David. They say, maybe this guy can offer us hope, and maybe he can turn things around, because he's done some things. He's done some exploits, and he's had some powerful moments, and he's done a good job in the palace, and everything that he's been put over, he's succeeded in. He seems like a good guy, and he seems like he's got a good head on his shoulders. And so this down on their luck group of men, they rally around the future but not yet king. In 1 Samuel 22, there is no complimentary adjective to describe this group of men, only the negative. There's not a positive description to be found. In fact, in the next chapter, if you just flip the page over to chapter 23, David sees that the Philistines are attacking a city called Keilah, and he inquires of the Lord. He said, should I go and attack the Philistines? Should I intervene in this situation? The Lord answers him, yeah, go ahead and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. And so David, he's got the courage. He's taken on some enemies before. And David has the answer from the Lord. So that's even better than just going by yourself. But David's men, the ones who have just joined him, they fess up to him. They're like, whoa, time out. We got to admit something. David, we're afraid to be here in Judah. We are afraid to be in our own country. So how much more are we going to be afraid to go down to Keilah and fight the Philistines? David, we're scared. And in case you didn't recognize the state of your followers just yet, we're not exactly a bunch of incredible individuals. We came to you because we were in distress. We came to you because we had nothing. David, we're the mistreated ones. How do you expect us to go and fight the Philistines? We're the ones who are down on our luck. We're not really any better off than they are. We're the ones who are in debt. And David, we're just not powerful men, and we're scared of those guys. David, we're afraid. And David's men, they tell him, we're not up for the task. And so David, he prays again, because he's like, well, what am I going to do? I'm pretty sure I heard from God to tell me to go and intervene in that situation. And the Lord, he comes back and he reassures David, no, you can. You can do it. And so David, he musters up his men. He says, listen, man, well, we can do it. You can do it. The Lord is with us, and he will deliver them into our hands. And so David, he takes this bunch of men, and they go for their first fight together. Can't imagine how disorganized that must have looked like. And they go to Keilah, and they strike the Philistines with what the Bible describes as actually a mighty blow. And they save the inhabitants of Keilah. And so these men, the future king's men, they have very humble beginnings. They're nothing to look at and be like, wow, aren't those an incredible bunch of guys? No, they're a bunch of scaredy cats. They're a bunch of down on their luck, miserable guys. But David, the future king, he encourages them. And God does a mighty work through them. And although they started out as desperate, and although they started out as those in distress and dead and discontent with their lot in life, they didn't stay that way. They became loyal men. They became the future king's men.
Yeah.
And the future king trained them, and the future king equipped them for the task at hand. And these 400 men, they could have become an unruly gang.
Yeah.
They could have been a ragtag mob of rebels out on the street, just robbing people as they come by, but they didn't. Because the future king, he refined them. He gave them a purpose. The future king, he trained them into a disciplined army, so much so that 1 Chronicles 12 and 8, he describes them as actually mighty men of valor.
Yeah.
Men who were trained for battle, who could handle a shield and a spear, whose faces were like the faces of lions, and they were as swift as gazelles on the mountains. Yes, they used to be afraid, and they used to be in distress, but as they spent time with David, as they spent time with the king,
Right.
the future king, as they became obedient king's men, they were transformed into something far greater than what they thought was possible.
Yes.
The
Amen.
king transformed their lives, and he transformed these group of men into a group of mighty and great warriors, men of valor.
Yeah.
They used to be afraid to fight the Philistines, but by being with the king, their lives were completely transformed.
Yes.
Right. Right.
In fact, the next time that they're at the cave of Adullam, because they come back there, these king's men are described in a very different way. They are no longer just a group of 400 men scared to fight and living in distress and panic and despair. No, they've come a very long way from that.
Yeah.
As you have just seen, they return to the cave of Adullam, and they are split into different companies. 1 Chronicles 11:15 says, "Now 3 of the 30 chief men,
Yeah.
went down to the rock to David into the cave of Adullam." 3 of the 30 chief men.
Yeah.
So now they have a disciplined, functioning military unit. See, the king spent time
Right.
with his men.
Yeah.
Do you see the parallel I'm trying to put towards you
Right,
today?
yeah.
The king spent time with his people. They used to be desperate, and when they came to the king, they weren't all that great to look at, and they weren't all that powerful. But when they spent time with the king, these desperate and destitute and in-debt people turned into a powerful,
Right.
mighty
Yes.
force as
Right.
they followed the king around and were
Right.
trained by the king. Do you see? When you spend time with God, he takes you from that debt and the despair, and he turns you into a mighty man, powerful for victory.
Thank you, Jesus.
In fact, there are 30 notable mighty men of King David. And these 30 men, to put you to the modern equivalent, they are the Navy SEALs of ancient times.
Yeah.
These guys are tough. Brother Shane, he'd call them a hard ticket. These guys are tough.
Yeah.
In fact, the Bible lists the things that these men have done, the victories and the battles that they have won. And talks about some of the other people, and it describes what they've done. But it says about the other guys who aren't the 30, it says, whenever it lists their exploits, it says they didn't attain
Yeah.
to those guys. These 30 men are elite warriors under the service of King David. And 3 of those elite warriors, they go to King David in the cave of Adullam, and David, he makes the statement, and he's reminiscing about when he was a child. He says, "Oh, that someone could give me a drink by the well that I used to drink from whenever I was a little boy." He just was reminiscing in his mind, just like when I was a child, I could just use some of that water right now. Well, little problem, David. The Philistines hold that city.
Yeah.
So you ain't going to get your drink of water. But these 3 elite Navy SEAL guys hear a request from their king. And they are king's men, and so we're not told that anybody else goes with them. We're told it's just the 3 of them. And they break through
Yeah.
the camp of the Philistines, and they push their way towards the gate of the city where the enemy is encamped and holding the position, and they get to the well of the gate, and as 2 of the guys fight off everybody else, one guy's just wheeling the crank of that well, trying to get him a drink of water, and the other guys are fending him off, being like, "All right, guy, they're calling in reinforcements now," and the guy gets the jug of water, and they're like, "You better not spill that, because we gotta hightail it out of there," and they exfil out of the sight, and these 3 guys, they go and break into the enemy lines just to get the king
Yeah.
a drink
Yeah.
of water.
Yeah.
When you serve the king, he turns you into an unstoppable fighting force. When you become a king's man, he will take you from your doubt and your debt and distress, and he's going to train you and shape you into a mighty man who is able to do more than what you ever thought was possible. See, God didn't give them a spirit of fear, and he doesn't want you to be in distress and doubt and taken over by the fears of your mind, but he gives you, the Bible says, power. He gives you a sound mind, and he gives you the ability to achieve more than you ever thought possible. He gives you the ability to overcome the enemy, and he gives you a spirit of boldness to take on challenges that you used to shy away from, that you used to be afraid about. Yes, these men, they started out in distress, but now they are confident and they are able to overthrow the enemy. They had turned from a group of men in distress to a group of mighty men. And that's what happens when you serve the king. He transformed you into a mighty, powerful individual. This group of 30 men, they're incredible. I mean, we're talking about a group of guys. One of them killed a lion in a pit on a snowy day. Like, it wasn't a sunny day. It was, I don't know how much snow, but any amount of snow is too much snow to be fighting a lion. And any amount of snow is too much snow to be fighting a lion, not just in an open field, but in a pit. In a big old hole, just full of snow, he takes down a lion. That's just one of those 30 elite Navy SEAL guys. Imagine, like, I'd be terrified of fighting a lion in a field, let alone, like, not even being able to grip my shoes because there's snow and they're slippery and it's holding me back. How do you even move? But he takes down a lion in a snowy pit. 1 Chronicles 11:26-27, it lists the group of these 30 mighty men. This is here where I want to kind of start to wrap things up today. Because it lists the group of these 30 elite Navy SEALs of David. And among that list, in the original 30, is a man named Uriah the Hittite. Uriah, he's among the original 30 mighty men of David. Some of the 30 got replaced because they died, and other people did enough exploits to replace him on the list, but he's part of the original 30. And he's an honorable king's man, and he's loyal, and he's trustworthy, and he had served with David over the years. He's one of these elite Navy SEAL type guys who fought shoulder to shoulder with King David before he was king. And he was one that sat around the campfire after battle with David. He's the one who the other guys trusted to lead them. He was one of these men of myth and legend. And he learned to fight under David, and he learned to lead men under David, and he was among the mighty warriors, the elite group of 30. He was part of the foundation of David's reign. And he didn't come to David when he was a king. He came to David before he was a king. He was the one who was with David through every circumstance, and he had hidden in every single cave with him, and he had ran away from Saul with him and took cover from hiding place to hiding place and chased by Saul and persecuted with David. He knew David personally. Uriah, he was a king's man. He was among the elite 30 that served his king. And Uriah, he really shows us what it means to be a king's man, what it means to be a servant of the king, what it means to be obedient to the king. See, later when David is the king and it's the time for military campaign, David should have been out fighting with his men as he used to, fighting and conquering land. And when he should have been out leading the charge, he was back at the palace. And he left the elite 30 to take care of the conquest, to lead it and to oversee it. I mean, they were, after all, trustworthy individuals. They were more than capable of leading armies. In fact, some of them killed 300 men just by themselves. They are certainly capable individuals. But David, he arises back in the palace, and he gets up from bed, and he's walking around on the roof, and he sees an exceedingly beautiful woman. And you know the story well. David inquires of the woman. He says, "Who is she?" And the news returns, well, isn't that Bathsheba? And that's the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And it's here that David should have just frozen up and not even been able to move. I mean, he should have been absolutely shocked. And he should have said, my apologies. I can't believe I just looked at the wife of Uriah. I can't believe I just looked at the wife of one of my mighty men, the one who's been with me all this time. Because Uriah the Hittite is the same Uriah that was married to Bathsheba. He was the same Uriah who was David's mighty man. It's Uriah the Hittite, the king's man. Uriah the loyal, and Uriah the faithful, and Uriah the one who fought beside him this whole time. Uriah the one who supported him before he was the king, and Uriah the one who had fought for you and did great and mighty things for you. Uriah the loyal, the obedient king's man. Yes, the very same Uriah who is part of this elite 30 group of men. And that is his wife. And David should have froze up, and he should have went to God right there and said, God, forgive me. I can't believe I'm sinning against my brother. The one who has been with me all this time. Because meanwhile, Uriah is out on campaign fighting the king's battles, fighting battles to advance the kingdom. And David finds out it's Bathsheba, but he sleeps with her anyways. And she conceives, and then he sends for Uriah to come home from the field because he's got to cover up the problem now. And Uriah, he comes back to the palace, and David asks him questions about how the military campaign is going. How is Joab? Joab is another member of the elite 30 individuals. He's also David's nephew. One of the officers leading the campaign, that's who Joab is. And David asks, how's Joab doing? Is the campaign going all right? How are the troops doing? Guys keeping up all right? You guys having good success? Good, I'm glad to hear it. They chat about the war and what progress has been made. And David says, it's getting late, so guess you should go home. Must be very tired. You should go get some rest. And Uriah leaves the king's house, but he doesn't go to his own house.
No.
He sleeps at the door of the king's house with all the servants of the king. So Uriah, he's a true king's man. He knew about duty. He knew about loyalty. He knew about service. In his mind, everyone is out on campaign right now fighting. So why should I get to go home and relax? David, we used to hide out in caves from Saul together. This is nothing. We used to take on the Philistines together. We used to put 800 to flight with just a handful of guys. David, this is really nothing. Uriah, he knows what life used to be like. He's a king's man. He's a true servant. He says, I'm just here to serve you. I'm going to sleep in the servants' quarters. His response is, the Holy Ark of Israel is in a tent. It doesn't even have a house. My commander Joab and his men, they're in open fields fighting. They don't even have cover right now. So this is no time for rest. This is no time to go and be cozy in my own bed at home. 2 days later, after unconvincingly asking Uriah to go to his own house, David, he writes a letter to Joab, who is, remember, a member of the elite 30, but also his nephew and one of the mighty men. And he tells him, Joab, put Uriah in the front of the battle, where the fighting is the thickest, and then draw back a bit, so that he will be struck down and killed. And he writes all these instructions in a letter, and he hands it to Uriah, and Uriah, the king's man, the faithful servant, carries his own death sentence all the way to the front line. And he never opens the letter. He never even thought about the contents of the letter. Why? Because he's a loyal king's man. He trusts the king. He's obedient to the king, and he is here to serve the king. And so Joab receives the instructions, and he begins the siege on the city, and he assigns Uriah to a place where he knows, the Bible says, he has reliable infantry, and where the fighting is going to be the thickest. And everybody who gets placed in Uriah's unit, well, they're happy. Because they know they've got one of the elite Navy SEALs leading them into the battle, and maybe in the back of their mind they're thinking, wow, this could be the day where another story goes down of the legend of Uriah, and I'm going to be included in that story. And so his men, his group is confident. And the men of the city, they come out for combat, and Uriah, the elite Navy SEAL, leads the line, and he leads the push to fight for his king. He leads the line to capture the city for his kingdom, and he leads the line of men around him forwards, and they are having great success. They are breaking through the enemy line, and they're making them waver, and they're pushing them back, and the men who are following Uriah forward start to fall back. They followed him all the way through, and they're about to reach the gate of the city, the Bible says. They're almost there. It's just one last little push, and they're about to reach a mythical, legendary story of success where God is working through them. But then they get a call from Joab. A call comes through the lines for you to just fall back a little.
Yeah.
And they do. Uriah is about to conquer the city for his kingdom. But the line begins to fall back. And these are the men who are supposed to be watching his back. These are the men who are supposed to be backing him up. But Uriah doesn't notice them going back. Why? Because he's a king's man. Uriah, he doesn't notice the line falling back because he is so consumed with advancing the kingdom. Uriah, he doesn't notice everybody else easing off of the fight because he is consumed with fighting for his king. He is sold out to serving the king, and that's why Uriah fights till the very end, because he's a loyal man, and he's a brave man. He's a king's man who follows the king's command, and he serves the kingdom even when people tempt him to take a break. Uriah serves the kingdom even when those around him start to falter, and he serves the kingdom even though it costs him his life, because he's a king's man till death. He is a servant of the king till death. Musicians, if you could come. So my question for you today is, if Uriah can serve a man who sins against him, if Uriah can be faithful to an earthly kingdom, and if Uriah can show such loyalty to David, how much more loyalty should we show to our king? If Uriah can serve with excellence and say, no, I'm not going to take a break. No, you're tempting me to just ease up and back off a little bit, but I'm a king's man. And I'm going to serve the kingdom, and I'm going to advance the kingdom. And even though the line's falling back, I don't know what they're doing. Why? Because I'm consumed with the kingdom. Other people in your life, they may fall away, but you've got to be consumed with the kingdom. Are you going to be obedient all through your life? Are you going to be obedient even if it leads you to death? Are you going to be obedient till your very last breath? Are you going to be consumed with the kingdom? I'm looking for someone to say, God, I want to be a king's man today. I want to be a king's man today. I'm not going to be tempted to falter, and I'm not going to be tempted to take a break, but God, I'm going to push forward. Even when those around me drop behind, I'm going to be obedient to death. I'm going to serve you to death. If you want to stand with me and come to the altar and make that declaration today, God, I'm going to serve. God, I'm going to serve, and I'm going to love you to my last breath. God, I'm going to love you, and I'm not going to fall back no matter the temptation. Jesus, I'm going to be a faithful, I'm going to be a loyal king's man.